Welcome, everyone, to Berkeley Unbound, the Bay Area Book Festival's one-day virtual mini-festival. I am Cherilyn Parsons, the director of the festival, and I am joined today by Arlie Hochschild and John A. Powell for a live conversation called Embracing the Other, looking at our deep national polarization. Arlie Russell Hochschild is one of the most influential sociologists working today. She is the author of 9 books, including most recently the National Book Award finalist and New York Times bestseller, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right, which became a guide for many struggling to understand the election of Donald Trump. She is a professor emeritus at UC Berkeley, sociology at UC Berkeley. John A. Powell is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. An internationally recognized scholar, he holds the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion and is a professor of Law, African American Studies, and Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. He's authored several books, including his most recent work, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society. So thank you, Arlie and John, for being with us on this live event at Berkeley Unbound. And let me just throw out an opening question. What is your assessment of the, what's at the roots of the terrible polarization afflicting our society today?
Well, you know, it's wonderful to be here, Cheryl, first, and to be on with John. I think we've are in the middle of this terrible polarization. I'd call it an empathy wall that's grown higher and higher. I don't think it's new, and I don't think that, you know, it's just a personal thing. I think there are interests, you know, oil and guns or Hollywood. I guess I want to just say that this isn't new. We've had Nixon, we've had Wallace, we've had a Civil War, and we've had, it's not new, and it's not just personal, because there are interests at play, and there are microphones, there are 2 different sources of news, so that we're coming to live in 2 different truths. And so part of getting, of de-othering the other person, part of climbing the empathy wall is to get to permit yourself to hear their truth. In other words, we all have to be translators, not just observers, but you need to hear at the frequency that the person on the other side is hearing, and then you take it from there. So, I guess part of it is outside. There are things we need to do, channels we need to establish that aren't there yet, and part of it is inside. Like when I do interviewing, when it goes bad, it's because, not because the person I'm talking to is mean or boring, it's because I'm being a mean or boring listener. There is a self in the listen, and we need to work on that too.
Okay, thank you. John, what are your thoughts about the roots of all of this?
Well, it's a very difficult time, and any one issue might not feel new, but the combination, I think, is pretty new, and the scale is unprecedented. And I think it's actually, we're sort of going into uncharted waters. So first of all, you have to realize that the sort of extreme polarization that we're experiencing in the United States is manifesting all over the world. So it'd be easy to think this is a, you know, Republican Democratic thing or a US thing. It's not. There's something happening in the world. And if something's happening in the world, there must be some phenomena, some causes that are indeed global. And I think there are. I think technology contributes to it. The fact that we apparently can see and talk to each other from all over the world. I think we can travel. People move all over the world now, and in some ways, you might say people in New York, London, and Moscow have more in common than people in New York and rural Idaho. So it's sort of an interesting turn of phrase. Also, immigration. So people are not just traveling all over the world; people are settling all over the world. We have more people living outside of their home country than the entire population of the United States, and those numbers will only increase. We have climate change. We're sitting here in California, sort of literally feeling grateful that we can breathe. And then, of course, you have with all those, you have meaning. How do we make meaning of those? And there's racial meaning, there's religious meaning. So in the U.S. context, obviously race plays a very big role, but religion plays a very, very big role. So who is the other? And I think that our national stories are breaking down. They don't work anymore. They can't hold. We don't have a container that we're all in. We don't have a central preference point that we all agree on. And so we yelling at each other. And I would even go a little further than Arlie, although I agree with what she says. It's not just we just have different interests. There's a sense that our way of being, who we are fundamentally, is in conflict. And that's not natural. I think people are exploiting that. There are powerful and elite people who, some people win by us being at each other's throat. Some people win by us being deeply polarized. And so there's some people who are invested in it for strategic purposes. And our destructive power is so much greater. If you think about the European wars and then World War I and World War II, each time they got exponentially more deadly. So our ability to harm each other and the earth, the ability to kind of have the impact we're having on climate change is unprecedented. So the capacity for harm and possibly good is there, but we don't have a container. And the containers we have don't work. And so we're trying to fumble our way into the future or hold on to a past that's already gone and never was.
Arlie, what's your response to what John was laying out?
I thought it was wonderful what he said, and what John has said is pointing to all the different ways in which what we're facing is new. But of course, we do have to remember the last two world wars and the Civil War, which were pretty awful. And remember that actually we got them behind us and did struggle to a new container. So I think we shouldn't be discouraged, I would say, and that part of what we need to do is at every level of national leadership, community leadership, grassroots level, find bridge builders on each side, and there are bridge builders on each side. But we don't know who we are. When, for example, I finished Strangers in Their Own Land, which was a study of the far right in the Deep South in a petrochemical center of development. And I wrote about that kind of deep story that I felt the people that I came to know held, and it made them feel that what they felt was true they believed in their truth. It's how they held to their truth. And after the book came out, I got a letter from a man who said, I'm an evangelical minister. I I live in Kilgore, Texas, and you've written a book that describes the people that I serve in my church and that describes me. And I thought, oh my goodness, this will be interesting. And then he said, but I think we're in the hands of a president who doesn't seem a Christian to me. And while we don't agree on anything, I think you've described them accurately, and I see myself in this. And at the end of the letter, he said, so imagine on this dire moment in history to receive a little good news from all places, Berkeley, California. So I wrote him back, thank you for your kind words and this and that. And then I signed it, your friend from Berkeley, California. And he and I have kept in touch, and I realized, look, he's reaching out. I thought I was reaching out. He's doing it too, and is now part of a consortium of people that are helping a young man get a new program up called a high school exchange program, and it now includes over 55 students in 7 states. You get south to go north, north to go south, and coasts to go inland, inland to go coast. It's just high school students, okay? But it's a start, and it's one of the 1,200 things we should be doing. And it started with this guy from the other side approaching me, not saying, oh, you're terrible, you know. So I think part of the answer is to find our opposite numbers on the other side.
John, you've written a lot about the self and othering, Institute for Othering and Belonging. How do you define self and other? I mean, Arlie's talking about reaching out to the other, presenting oneself. What are your definitions of these things?
Well, I think they're, like anything, like any important concept or word, whether it's othering or self or love, we have a sense of it, and then when we try to define it, we find it's incredibly complex and has a history. And if you're Greek, you have 7 different words for love, and so I was in a conversation recently. So there's different ways of thinking about the self. There's sort of a narrow sense of self. It's the self being autonomous, self-contained, self-constituted. I understand that you had Judith Butler on earlier. She writes about the self as well. And there's a different way of thinking about the self. You can think about the self as deeply relational, that we're always in relationship. And relationships are not just instrumental, they're constitutive. We only have a self if we have others. There's the African concept, I am because you are. And so there's not agreement. I mean, in a sense, you could say some of these tensions are so fundamental, because from religious, spiritual, to very practical. I gravitate toward the idea that the self is deeply, deeply interconnected, relational, and constitutional. In that sense, I agree very much with Judith Butler's approach to the self. The classical Western concept of the self is an extreme individual on his or her own self, even dreaming of fathering oneself, being so separated from everything. I share in my book when I talk about my dad, who died recently. My mom died some years ago, but my dad was a Christian minister. When I asked him about sin and death, he would say, sin is separation, and death is separation. And I said, separation from what? And he said, separation from God, separation from the universe, separation from nature, separation from each other. And to me, the way the West tends to, not everybody, gravitate toward a self is a self wrapped in death, because it's totally separated. And things you're separated from, but in relationship to nonetheless, you have fear of. So we fear nature. We fear each other. because we think we're separated from each other. And I think that's not only, and psychology now is doing a lot with that, I think it's not only spiritually problematic, I think it's psychologically and health problematic as well. I mean, we're literally born physically connected to another human being. So how do we actually lean into that connectivity and that interrelationship in a healthy way? And I think that what we're seeing in these two major narratives in terms of a small we where everyone else is a threat, or we where we're all in together, those are the two major global narratives that's competing right now. And it seems to me one is predicated deeply on separation and fear. The other one is predicated on connectiveness and hope. But it's not clear which one will win in the United States and in the world. And again, they have religious roots, they have political roots, and then people use them as well.
You know, I find that very interesting, John. And when we feel separate and alone, I think of ways in which I've encountered strangers and said, "Look, I come from another world. Hello." How does it go wrong, and how do you get over that and feel a connection to another person? I feel, for example, in myself when I'm talking to another person, that the function of what I say is to, the first thing that comes to mind is to present myself. Oh, here I am, right? And then the second thing is to defend myself. Oh, you're going to attack me from being from a democratic state or being a liberal, and you're not. You're going to attack me, and I have to defend myself. But the third stance is to take a leap, is to imagine a we and just say, I'm here to listen. And I find listening isn't a simple thing. It's much more than hearing. And listening is actually opening up yourself to a connection to the other. I had a man, I was introduced to a man by someone who said, oh, you know, she's from California. And this was a pipe fitter, older man, Pentecostal. He'd lost his wife. He'd raised 2 children on his own, very hard bitten. And he looked at me hard and he said, which part of California? Was it south or north? And I gave the wrong answer, Northern California. And he still was hard. And I just kept listening until he felt sure enough that his presented self was received. He didn't have to defend himself against me. And in the end, we didn't talk about politics, but he told me his story, and I felt connected, and he felt connected to me. So listening turns out to be a mysterious, powerful expression of self in a way, and that we always have to work on and get rid of bad ideas about. A lot of people think it's not important, actually, or that empathy isn't important. Actually, it's weakness. If you're too nice and you're too empathic, that's weakness. So I think we have to really re-examine that idea, or that you're lesser if you're empathic, or that you believe that only your people are in need of empathy, and others aren't. Or you stay in your fortress and think it's a job well done, and that you're actually doing political work or moral work to blame others within your fortress. So then I think there's a separation we aren't even naming, and that we may be afraid to name, where we stay in our bubble and don't reach out. And so part of this, and what I think universities ought to be teaching, is actually how to listen, how to be open, how to reach out, and not as some mindless thing, but as filling a deficit and looking at connecting that act to the larger critical moment that we're in.
John, you've looked at, a lot of your research has focused on just this. I mean, bridging divides, looking at what creates divides. What are your thoughts about this happening across races, across nations, across political perspectives?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think Arlie is right, but I think it's too simple in some ways, and I'll say why. I think listening is critical. And I think deep, compassionate listening, empathetic listening, I think we should do more of that, and not just teach it in school, but teach it everywhere. But also there's a power dynamic. My family's from the South. Black people in the United States, they were invisible as people. You had literally the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court saying, Black people can never be people, and they can never be part of the polity. In some ways, to me, I think that's what we're still fighting over. We're still fighting the Civil War. And it's not just interpersonal. And there's a huge power dynamic. So when Chief Justice Taney said that, literally, think about it. Up until relatively recently in this country, a Black person cannot appear in court. A Black person cannot speak and testify against a white person. So there wasn't this desire to hear. Yes, and within the power dynamics, what we see is that Blacks, in order to survive, have to actually listen to and understand and have some sensibility about whites. It wasn't reciprocal. Whites did not need to know anything about Blacks. The similar dynamics between men and women. So the interpersonal is really important. And I think we can't do without it. But it's not nearly enough. It's not just, when people dropped bombs on Hiroshima, they didn't see them. They were 6 or 7 miles up in the sky, and they dropped bombs. So I think that's right in terms of creating space where we can share each other's stories, where we can hear each other's pain. But there are structures and containers and deep stories and narratives that we live in as well. And so we have to embrace that. And I think it makes it harder. And there are some people who literally, I spent time in South Africa under apartheid. Literally, if you were Black in South Africa under apartheid, there were spaces where you were not allowed to speak unless you were spoken to by a white person. So that's institutionally silencing people, saying, we don't want to hear you. And part of the reason people are marching in the streets is because they're saying, we don't have avenues to be heard. We have to create new avenues to be heard because the society is refusing to hear us. When they read the list of Black women who've been killed by the police and they say their names, they're saying they've been erased. And Sarah Banu, which is I see you, it says the God in me says the God in you. Yes, we all need that and want that, but we have deep structures, histories where we deny that. And part of racism and sexism and xenophobia is saying to someone, when Bill Clinton said to men and women joining the military, you can join, but don't tell us if you're gay or lesbian. We don't want to know about it. Silence. That's coming from the President of the United States. So there are all these ways in which, I think what I thought about, I live in Berkeley, like most people. I try to do recycling but the reality is, to be honest, I feel like that will never get to scale. There are so many things that are threatening the earth, that is threatening each other, that we can recycle and make Berkeley whatever, and the earth will still be under stress. So the power dynamic and the institutional dynamic of it is also quite real. And oftentimes we don't bring that in. I grew up in Detroit, so if a factory worker is talking to a boss, literally a boss, the dynamics is skewed. So it's not just that we have relationships, we have to have the right relationship where we take power and dignity into effect as well.
Oh, absolutely. I agree entirely with what you're saying. You know, my husband and I were Fulbright scholars in India and Trivandrum and Kerala a few years back, where there's not only untouchability, upper class to lower caste, but unseeability. And it was still going on in the 1990s when we were there, that some people were, the Brahmins didn't want to even see the Sudras. Get an umbrella, you know, in years past. So, yeah, so in a way it goes back to, I don't think we're saying different things. You're saying there's, we need different containers for listening that some people haven't, that there's a, let me put it this way, haves and have-nots of being heard. Yeah.
What do you both think is necessary to make this happen? I mean, in South Africa, we had Mandela, right, who bridged. Barack Obama had perhaps those capacities, but one could argue his election as president further polarized. Because of, as you were saying, Arlie, is like someone was saying, the Civil War is still being fought. What are your thoughts about how to take these ideas and make it happen in this country today?
Well, I would say that the power dynamics that John is talking about and the inequalities, both the psychological and economic expressions of them, we have to put that on the table, and we have to push for policies through, I think, the government, but also civic expression, that rearrange and change those power dynamics. But I think we have to figure out how to do that. If we look at Nelson Mandela, I mean, he was a master both at power politics and at person-to-person diplomacy. He actually learned Afrikaans. You know, there he was in prison, and he was strategically brilliant in seeing the human in his opponents. I think Gandhi was the same. So in this moment of strife, I think we have some things to learn from the greatest leaders.
Yeah. I want John's thoughts on this. I want to just throw in a question that just came in from the audience, which is there a country that is a good role model that we could learn from? So John, throwing this over to you.
So I think we have to do things on multiple levels, and I think part of the thing, you know, we talk about belonging, and belonging is the idea of we're co-creating, we're building something new, and we're building a new society, we're building a future, and I had the really honor and pleasure of working on the education system in South Africa after apartheid, and afterwards I was invited to come have. It was actually a wonderful story because I was teaching, and they invited me to come to honor me for my work, and I said I can't. I'm in the middle of the school year, and it takes forever to fly to South Africa. And they said, you know, to them I knew it was not just a casual offer, that it's part of their culture, it's part of showing respect. So they pressed, and I said no, and then they said, would you come if we could arrange a private dinner with Nelson Mandela? So I flew to South Africa, and so Arlie's right. I mean, but Nelson Mandela is amazing, and you know what he did strategically. He did learn Afrikaans when he was in Robben's Island. He did have the guards teach him the Afrikaans culture. And for people who don't know, Afrikaans was the language of the Dutch. It was the language of the most radically right-wing whites in South Africa, and the English were there, but. Doing their thing, but they were not as hard as the Dutch, who actually brought in apartheid. And when Nelson Mandela got out, he met with the head of the South African government to have a peace, to have a truce. And he said, you have to convince the general. And Nelson Mandela, Robert Sapolsky talks about that in his book, Behave. He talks about recognizing other people's sacred symbols. So I won't go through the whole thing because of the interest of time, but the whole negotiation took place in Afrikaner. And the general was shocked that Nelson Mandela even knew Afrikaner, and let alone that he would agree to have this negotiation in the general's language. And the general had this entourage outside waiting, and the general was an avowed, explicit racist. There was nothing subtle about him. And when he left, this entourage said, so what happened? What happened? And he said, I don't know if I like this Nelson Mandela guy, but he can convince anyone of anything. We're going to have a peace. We're going to have a truce. Now, the thing that's important about that is Nelson Mandela reached out to the general. But at the same time, Nelson Mandela had guns and an army. He reached out from a certain degree, not only of physical strength, which he had with his army and his guns, but he also reached out from a sense of deep moral strength and conviction. And so I think all of us have to be willing to be bridgers. And there's a risk in being bridgers. It might not work. You might get slapped down. And I think in terms of countries where this works, countries is big, but there are expressions of it all over the world. And of course, everyone thinks about New Zealand now. And some people have said it's not accidental that a number of the countries that did well in terms of COVID were headed by women. Certainly, I mean, if you think about when there was the killing in New Zealand, their 9/11 and our 9/11. Our 9/11 was like, we're going to get the guns, we're going to, run the people down, and we polarized it. Theirs was like was an embracing that we're all part of it. We're all part of New Zealand. So part of the thing I think we need is real leadership, real stories, real examples, new structures. I mean, it doesn't help. If you look at the most profound polarization, for the most part, is where people don't live close to each other. It's not impossible, but it's harder to hate up close. And so we've addressed that problem by segregating. So we're not close to each other. We're physically separated. But I think, again, people point to New Zealand, people point to people with power trying to reach across, and I think part of really building and acknowledging that we all count, that we all have dignity, that we're all connected, is actually sharing power. And so if you look at Germany, Germany has a rule that every company has to have workers on their board. The company has to share power. Right. Our structure is actually making it harder. For most companies in the United States, it's against the law for workers to be on company boards. So again, we're separating people. And so I think there are many things we can and should do. And I think there's an opening now, and we should seize that opening and do what we can.
Right. Looking at our own domestic racial divide now, I'm now doing some interviews in Eastern Kentucky, which we think of as, and it is, a very down on its heels white place. And Kentucky, 60% went for Trump. In the region I'm looking at, 80% did. And right in the heart of that region are young people who are not only not racist, they're anti-racist. There was a neo-Nazi march down Pikeville in 2017. It was a precursor to Charlottesville. And I thought, oh, this is a perfect storm. You take coal jobs out, you bring opiate crisis in, and then the neo-Nazis are uniting the right. I thought, oh my goodness, I've got to look at this. And in first of all, the protesters outnumbered the marchers. And among the protesters were signs. One sign said, "Rednecks against racism." And I talked to a lot of young people, what's this? And actually, they are young anti-racists and they are white, but they are going back to the Battle of Blair Mountain, when in 1921 there was a huge standoff between coal mine owners and the miners, who were only paid in scrip and had 10-hour days and were striking. And it was the United Mine Workers, where black miners, white miners, and foreign miners who had been shipped in so as to the owners wanted to divide and rule, got together and struck together. And they wore company issued red scarves. And the people I talked to said that's the origin of the term redneck. It meant you were union, and union meant you were belonging. You were widening the we the worker. So there are hidden pockets of history where we least expect them, in the heartland of what looks like a solid block of Trump support, opposition to what we're talking about here. So part of our task is to seek that out and get to know it.
I agree. And let me just add one thing, Cherilyn, on that. So going back to Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky was sued in the 1970s because they forcibly, literally, with government money, segregated white kids and black kids from schools. Actually, they segregated white kids from all other kids of colors, black, Indian, Native American. So they sued. It was mainly black and white, but it was whites versus people of color. And the court found that they had intentionally segregated the schools, and it ordered them to desegregate. The Chamber of Commerce wrote an amicus brief, which means friends of the court, saying, don't make us do this. You're going to destroy our city. You're going to destroy our culture. So the idea of being with, quote unquote, the other to them was so threatening that they wrote this passionate amicus brief saying, don't do this, U.S. Supreme Court. And the court did it anyway. And the schools were integrated, not perfectly, but they were integrated. And there's a thing where the court says once the school has achieved unitary status, you no longer can actually force them to integrate. So some legal technicalities I don't want to get into. But the gist of it is the school board adopted, and once they were no longer under the court's order, they adopted a voluntary integration plan. In other words, they didn't have to integrate anymore. They said, we want to maintain the integration. The U.S. Supreme Court, in a case called Parents Involved, told them they could not do that. Said, you can't use race to integrate schools because it violates the U.S. Constitution unless there is a finding that you deliberately are segregating, and that finding is no longer operative. The long and short of it is that the Chamber of Commerce wrote an amicus brief in this case, Parents Involved, saying to the court, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, we wrote a brief saying, don't make us integrate. We're writing a brief now saying, don't make us go back to segregation. We were wrong. That was one of the best things that happened to us, and you're making us go back. And I actually worked on that with them. And these were not, Arlie, these were not young people, these were old people. But the court actually insisted that they could not use race to integrate schools. So we don't care. We don't care if you have to go back to, and they were saying, don't make us go back to those old ways. We were wrong. We learned a lesson, and the court turned a blind eye. And again, it just shows how complicated it is. This is not just people doing it and not doing it. We have institution and power players making things happen as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Several questions from the audience. Let me just jump to one that is directly relevant. When president, would Biden, quote, reaching across the aisle be a necessary beginning, a necessary attempt to change the culture? And I would add, do you think that's possible today? And what can make it effective?
Right. I think, first of all, that in his very kind of unbullying, mild manner, there's kind of a statement that will be a relief for many people. But I think he should go to Middle America and actually say, well, under Trump, is life any better? What's actually happened to you? What have the last 3.5 years been like? And in Appalachia, you could say, has coal come back? No, it hasn't come back. Have good jobs come in? No. The minimum wage in red states is $8.08, and minimum wage in blue states is 10 something. And Trump is against a federal minimum. So economically, it's not better. Are we getting a handle on OxyContin and heroin? No, all of this. And hasn't Trump actually built a wall against higher education? He's cut the Department of Education 10%, Pell Grants. So it's actually not building a wall between us and Mexico. He's building a wall between the blue-collar class he hopes to siphon the discontent from and people with BAs and who have access to the newer jobs and the better paid jobs. So I think part Biden could say that, and then he could say, I see who you are, and I have a vision for a whole United States where we're in this thing together.
Yeah, we're beginning to run out of time. We're moving toward that. So, John, what is your take on that question? I mean, it's interesting. Arlie was talking earlier about bridging the empathy wall and listening and talking. So from your perspective, what would you advise the next president to do to help overcome this really awful polarization?
Well, one candidate, I think, would be interested in reducing the polarization. The other candidate would be interested in maintaining it. So this would be real. So when Obama became president, he said his number one goal was to have bipartisan support. And I knew Obama before he was president and worked feverishly on his campaign. And when he said that, I said, that's a mistake. And it's not that and I believe that we talk about a circle of human concern where everyone is in the circle, not just humans, but all other life expressions in the earth itself. But you can't make someone come to the table. And Republicans have made it clear that their strategy was to make Obama fail. He would propose to them their own policies and they would reject them. They actually had no interest in him succeeding. They're willing to shoot themselves in the foot to make sure he's succeeding. And so we have to get beyond that. I mean, Dr. King talked about, someone asked him how would he deal with the segregationists, and he says, I'll leave my door open and a light on, meaning I'm always open and I'm willing to talk, but I'm not going to chase them. I do think that if it is President Biden, he should make it clear that he see a future where we all belong. And not just culturally, but also economically, and start moving us in that direction. That he does start listening to people, as Arlie said, but instead of saying those people, instead of us and them, it's us and us. We are in this together. I'm not gonna leave anyone behind. And I'm willing to actually hear stuff, but I'm not willing to consider a politics of division, a politics of hate. I'm not going there. And if you, as Republicans or whoever, insist upon staying there, then we have a huge problem. He can be Nelson Mandela. Again, Nelson Mandela had an army and had guns. He didn't give them up, but he said, I'm willing to talk to you in your own language. And if we can't agree, then we'll see what happens.
Right. Well, just a couple more minutes. If there's a parting thought from you, just sort of on a personal level, what people can do, why you have embraced this field, and really what your advice is overall to people listening to this and to the society in general. Arlie, how about you go first?
Well, first, a lot of people are feeling very beaten up, I think. It's been one thing after another, not only climate and COVID and job insecurity, but increasing social class divide and monopolies growing and mom and pop stores failing. There's a lot of work ahead, and I think people have felt overwhelmed. So I think the first thing is just taking a leaf from John, just be with others that are your friends, get your spirits back up. Taking care of yourself is taking others, and then realizing the enormity of the work ahead. So I think getting out the vote is critical. Getting the vote, getting people who are poll takers, and to make it safe to vote, to guard people so that they're not intimidated by Proud Boys as they go to the polls, and then guarding the integrity of the vote, and making sure that it's not discredited. I think that is actually the number one job, and getting Joe Biden to be our next president.
Thank you. John?
Well, I know we're almost out of time, but I would endorse what Arlie just said. I think we have to learn to turn toward each other and not against each other, instead of turn on each other. There's a story about someone who's meets up with God, and he says, "I don't understand. You've abandoned us. We have the earth is dying, and we're turning. There are wars, and how could you abandon us like that? Why don't you help us?" And God said, "She says, I've given you everything you need." So, what do you mean? Say, I've given you each other. You just won't take advantage of it. So I think we have to also learn to just turn toward each other, help each other, really learn to love each other. We need to belong. I mean, that's a fundamental human need. Maslow talks about that. And then we need to build institutions and structures to make it real. And we need to also be willing to cut each other some slack. And as Arlie said, to listen to each other even when we don't always agree.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. We had a couple other questions that we couldn't get to. I'm sorry. I will share them with the speakers and see if they have any response, and we can put it on our blog or social media. So I want to thank Arlie and John, and we hope you will keep watching throughout the day for more insightful and conversation-sparking programs. At 3:30 p.m., we have Davia Nelson of the Kitchen Sisters, who will be interviewing Alice Waters and Saru Jayaraman on food systems. And after that, at 5, we have Berkeley Law Dean Erwin Chemerinsky speaking with Congresswoman Barbara Lee. And I just want to again thank Arlie and John for your own compassion and kindness and generosity in joining us and doing the work you're doing and sharing these ideas. That alone, I think, is going to go a long way toward solving the problems that we're facing. So thank you again. And to everyone watching, you're part of the solution. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Cherilyn Parsons, and you have been watching Berkeley Unbound, a program of the Bay Area Book Festival.